In a school ruled by fear, one girl's power was absolute until someone who had none walked in and rewrote everything she thought she knew about strength. Stay till the end, because the twist you won't see coming will leave you questioning what really defines greatness. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where in the world you're watching from. The first light of morning spilled through the massive glass panes of Rosemont Academy, bathing the marble floors in a quiet, expensive glow. The school was more like a palace than a place of learning where limousines lined the driveway and children wore last names that carried weight in boardrooms. Among them all, one name made the entire academy hold its breath: Sienna Vale. She was the daughter of Douglas Vale, the wealthiest man in the city, a man whose company owned entire skylines. Everyone at Rosemont knew the rules: never contradict, Sienna never question her tone, and never forget who her father was. The last teacher who dared to challenge her had resigned before lunch. 10 had quit that year alone. The staff whispered about her temper, the way she could slice through a conversation with one glare. Even the headmaster, a man twice her age and proud of being impossible to intimidate, lowered his eyes when she passed. Her presence filled every hallway, sharp, elegant, untouchable, but behind those flawless uniforms and diamond earrings. Sienna's silence was heavier than her pride. Her anger wasn't born of arrogance, it was grief wearing armor. Her mother had died 3 years ago, and no one had ever dared speak her name since. Sienna had built her own fortress of cruelty to survive inside the hollow space that loss left behind. That same morning, while the students sipped imported coffee and checked their designer watches, a different kind of man entered the building. His name was Caleb Monroe, a tall black janitor in a faded Navy uniform that had seen better years. His boots were old, his hands marked with years of labor, but his movements carried a quiet grace, like someone who had learned to take pride in every simple thing he did. His name tag was crooked, and yet he adjusted it before stepping into the main hall. People like him weren't meant to be noticed at Rosemont, but the way he stood calm, grounded, unbothered made him different. There was something disarming about him, something steady that didn't belong in a place built on image and fear. No one looked twice at him. The students brushed past as if he were invisible, and Caleb didn't mind. He'd spent his life being unseen by people who thought their money made them bigger than kindness. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to earn enough to raise his little girl, Are. She was 8, full of life and laughter, waiting for him every evening at their small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, one bedroom above a noisy laundromat, but it was theirs. Every night before bed, Ari would ask him, "Did you smile today, Dad?" And he'd always say, "I tried my best." It was their promise to keep light alive, even when life felt dark. Caleb's first morning at Rosemont was quiet, almost too quiet. As he mopped the hallway outside the art studio, he noticed the walls bright, sterile, lifeless. He heard the faint echo of a girl's voice, sharp and cold, scolding someone. It was Sienna. She was standing over a staff member criticizing a painting hung slightly crooked. "If my father saw this, you'd be gone by noon," she said, her voice smooth as glass, and just as cutting. When she turned, she caught Caleb watching. Her blue eyes narrowed like daggers. "What are you looking at?" she snapped. Caleb simply smiled, slow and genuine. "Nothing that can't be fixed," he said softly. For a moment, the hallway froze. No one spoke to her like that, calm, unafraid. Most people stumbled, apologized, or ran, but Caleb didn't. He just went back to mopping. Sienna's throat tightened, not in anger, but in confusion. For the first time in a long while, someone hadn't looked at her with fear, or worse, pity. That night, lying in her silk-covered bed, she found herself replaying that moment. His tone, his eyes, his calm. It shouldn't have mattered. Yet somehow it did. The next morning she saw him again. He was sweeping the entrance before the students arrived, humming softly. Under his breath, an old gospel tune that made the hallway feel warmer. She watched from a distance, unseen. The rhythm, the peace in his face irritated her. How could someone with nothing look so at ease when she, with everything, felt nothing but hollow? She turned away sharply, pretending not to notice. But every time she passed, her eyes found him fixing a broken locker handle, helping an elderly teacher carry books, wiping paint off the floor no one else cared about. There was a rhythm to his quiet kindness, one she didn't understand. He never asked for thanks. He never expected anyone to see. Yet Sienna did. She noticed every small thing, even though she hated that she did. At lunch, when the principal passed by, Caleb greeted him with a nod. The man didn't respond, only adjusted his tie and walked faster. Caleb smiled anyway. He had learned that dignity had nothing to do with wealth. Sienna watched this happen from the balcony above the courtyard. She should have laughed, should have called him pathetic. Instead, she felt something different, a small crack in her certainty. He wasn't weak. He was free. That night, she painted again, a chaotic swirl of colors and black lines, but in the corner, almost without thinking, she added a small streak of yellow. The next morning, Caleb Monroe arrived at Rosemont before the sun had fully climbed over the skyline. The city still smelled like dew and diesel, and the streets were quiet, except for the soft hum of his bus engine. He carried his lunch in a brown paper bag folded neatly twice the way his daughter liked to do it for him. Inside were 2 sandwiches, one for now, one for later, and a small note written in a child's handwriting. "Smile today, Daddy." He tucked it into his pocket and stepped off the bus. The glass doors of Rosemont Academy reflected him back, a tall black man, with weary eyes and a uniform too old for a place too rich. But his shoulders stayed straight. He didn't need to belong here to do his job right. As he walked the polished corridors, students passed by talking about ski trips and designer sneakers, their laughter echoing against the marble. None of them noticed him. He moved quietly, a rhythm of purpose in every motion. That calm came from years of surviving places harsher than these shiny walls. Caleb had worked construction, delivery, even graveyard shifts at the factory when his wife got sick. When she passed, Ari was only 3. Since then, every day had been about keeping his promise to her to stay kind, no matter how cruel the world turned. The second day at Rosemont tested that promise early. As Caleb wiped down the stair railings, he heard loud voices from the upper landing. Sienna Vale again. She was arguing with a teacher about an assignment deadline, her words sharp enough to cut glass. The teacher, red-faced and exhausted, tried to reason with her. "Miss Vale, the rules apply to everyone." Sienna tilted her head and replied coolly, "Rules are for people without options." Caleb looked up, saw her storm down the stairs, and instinctively stepped aside. Her shoulder brushed him the scent of expensive perfume, mixing with anger. The cup she carried slipped from her hand, spilling dark coffee across the spotless floor. She froze, waiting for him to react. Most would panic, apologize, beg not to be blamed. Caleb didn't. He crouched down, cleaned the spill, and said softly, "It's okay. Accidents happen." Sienna stared at him, her jaw tight, her expression unreadable. No one had ever spoken to her like that, without fear, without judgment, without the hunger to impress. For the second time, she felt something she couldn't name. Her heart skipped, but she masked it with disdain and walked off. Caleb didn't watch her go. He had work to finish. Later that afternoon, while fixing a broken hinge in the music room, Caleb heard laughter, mocking, not joyful. 2 boys from the upper class were joking about him imitating his slow walk, his uniform. "Hey, janitor, maybe clean our sneakers too," one said, tossing a crumpled napkin near him. Caleb didn't respond. He just picked it up, tossed it in the bin, and kept working. The boys grew louder until a voice cut through their laughter like a blade. "Get out." Sienna stood in the doorway, eyes cold as stone. The boys froze. "You think mocking him makes you special?" she said. "He's done more for this school in 2 days than you have all year." They stammered apologies and left, but Sienna didn't look at Caleb. She just said almost under her breath, "Don't let them bother you." He turned a faint smile, tugging his lips. "They don't," he replied. That brief exchange lodged itself somewhere deep in her chest. She didn't understand why she cared at all. After classes ended, the hallways grew quiet again. Caleb stayed late to finish sweeping the atrium. The smell of lemon cleaner filled the air. He liked this time of day, the calm after everyone left. He could hear his own thoughts then. Sometimes he thought about Ari waiting at home, probably drawing another picture for him. Her world was small, but bright-colored with crayons and hope. She always asked him to tell her about the fancy school. She imagined castles and chandeliers, not marble walls filled with lonely children. Caleb never told her that wealth often made people poorer in spirit. He just said it's beautiful there because that's what fathers do. They make the world sound softer for their children. As he packed up his tools, he found something on the floor, a sketchbook left behind. He flipped it open, curious. The pages were full of dark swirls, stormy colors, and broken shapes. At the bottom, in delicate handwriting, was the name Sienna Vale. He stared at it for a moment. The drawings weren't arrogant, like their owner. They were aching, desperate, searching. He closed the book and placed it on a nearby table. Some pain, he thought, hides behind the loudest noise. The next morning, when Sienna walked into the atrium, the sketchbook was waiting for her, clean, dry, and unmentioned. A yellow sticky note sat on top with 4 words in tidy handwriting. "You forgot this yesterday." She looked around but saw no one. Still, she recognized the handwriting. It wasn't the ink of a teacher or a peer. It was his, Caleb Monroe, the janitor. Something inside her shifted a feeling she hadn't known in years. Respect, maybe, or gratitude. She wasn't sure. As days passed, Caleb became part of the school's quiet rhythm. He never spoke much, but his presence filled the empty spaces between classes. Teachers found their shelves, repaired doors, fixed art supplies, organized. Sienna Vale arrived earlier than usual, her driver holding an umbrella over her as she stepped from the car, heels clicking against the wet pavement. Inside, the halls were silent except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Most students hadn't arrived yet, and the emptiness of the building made her feel larger, more in control, like the queen of her own small kingdom. She carried her coffee and portfolio, her head held high, unaware that Caleb Monroe was already there, cleaning the art studio she would soon enter. He'd been there since dawn, mopping floors and repairing a cabinet door someone had slammed too hard the week before. The rain outside didn't bother him. Rain meant the air smelled cleaner, and cleaner air made him feel alive. He moved quietly, humming under his breath the same gospel tune Ari loved to sing before school. As he worked, he thought about her small voice saying, "Smile today, Daddy." And despite the tiredness in his shoulders, he did. When Sienna entered the studio, the scent of disinfectant hit her first. She frowned at the mop bucket in the corner, then at the janitor who stood beside it. He looked up briefly, nodding respectfully, before going back to his work. His calm annoyed her. "You're still here," she said, her tone clipped. Caleb didn't take offense. "Just finishing up, ma'am," he replied evenly. She blinked. No one called her ma'am without sarcasm or fear. She turned away, pretending to study her painting, a dark swirl of grays and reds still unfinished. He noticed the chaos in it, the kind of color choice that came from pain, not imagination. He didn't say a word. When he started moving the mop, she sighed, loudly irritated by the sound. "Do you have to do that now?" she asked, not looking at him. Caleb paused, leaned on the mop handle, and said quietly, "This floor's been waiting all weekend. I figured it deserved a little attention." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly as he said it. She froze halfway between annoyance and curiosity. No one had ever replied to her that way, honest but gentle. For the briefest second, she didn't know what to say. Just then, her art instructor entered, balancing a stack of frames. "Miss Vale," he said nervously, "we'll need your project ready by Wednesday. The showcase judges will be visiting." Sienna frowned. "It's not finished." The instructor smiled weakly. "Then finish it." She glared at him until his smile faded, then turned back to the easel and threw her brush down. "This school has no idea what art means," she muttered loud enough for both men to hear. Caleb bent to pick up the brush she'd dropped. "Maybe art's just telling the truth," he said quietly, handing it to her. She stared at him, caught off guard. "What do you know about truth?" she asked sharply. He met her eyes. Enough to know it doesn't always look pretty. The silence between them thickened. For the first time in her life, she couldn't decide whether she'd been insulted or understood. The rain outside turned heavier, beating against the windows. Students began trickling in, laughter echoing faintly from the hallway. Sienna turned away, pretending to work on her painting. but her hand trembled slightly. Caleb finished cleaning, gathering his supplies. Before leaving, he said, "Don't let the mess scare you. Sometimes that's where the good part starts." She didn't answer. But later, when she looked at her canvas, she noticed how the red streaks she had once hated seemed less chaotic now, almost alive. She didn't understand why that bothered her. At lunch, her friends gathered at the cafeteria table, talking about shopping trips and summer homes. She smiled automatically, but her mind wasn't there. She kept hearing his words, "Nothing that can't be fixed." When one of the girls mentioned the new janitor, saying he looked too serious for his job, Sienna felt something tighten inside. "Maybe he takes pride in it," she said suddenly. The others went quiet. What one asked, confused. Sienna blinked, realizing what she'd said, and covered it with a smirk. Forget it. Just saying not everyone's lazy. They laughed it off, but the thought lingered. That evening, Caleb took the bus home through the drizzle. The windows fogged up and the city lights blurred into gold and silver streaks. He watched his reflection, remembering the girl from the art room. There was something in her eyes, fury wrapped around loneliness. He'd seen it before in men who built walls too high to climb. He wondered what had made her so guarded, then dismissed it. She wasn't his problem. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she might become part of his story, whether he wanted it or not. Meanwhile, Sienna returned home to a mansion that felt emptier than usual. Her father was still at his office downtown, his absence so routine she no longer noticed. Dinner was prepared by staff the same as every night, served on fine china she never used. She sat at the grand piano, fingers hovering over keys she hadn't touched since her mother's funeral. The silence pressed down on her like a weight. She thought again of Caleb's voice, calm and sure, saying, "It's okay. Accidents happen." She hated how those words echoed in her mind. No one talked to her like that, like she was just another person, not someone to be feared or managed. She stared at her reflection in the piano's glossy surface, and for the first time, she didn't recognize herself. The next day at school, she caught sight of him again, this time fixing a broken locker hinge. Students passed by oblivious, but she slowed down without realizing it. His movements were steady, his face unreadable. She wanted to say something, anything, but pride clamped her throat shut. Instead, she left her coffee cup balanced on the nearby bench as she walked away. Minutes later, she turned back and saw him quietly pick it up and toss it into the trash. No irritation, no sigh of complaint. Just calm. That calmness was the worst part. It made her anger look childish. The next morning came cold and windless, the kind of gray day that hung heavy over Rosemont Academy like a warning. The rain had stopped, but the ground still glistened, and the smell of wet concrete filled the air. Sienna Vale walked through the gate with her head high as always, but something inside her felt uneven. She didn't want to admit it yet. The janitor's words from the day before still echoed in her mind like an unwanted song. She tried to push it away by focusing on her routine, her coffee, her planner, the unread messages from friends she didn't really like, but everything around her seemed sharper, quieter, almost watching her. When she entered the hallway, she saw him again. Caleb Monroe was polishing the trophy case, humming under his breath, his reflection gliding across the glass beside her own. She stopped for a second before catching herself. He noticed her pause, nodded respectfully, and went back to work. The simple gesture irritated her, more than rudeness ever could. He didn't treat her like royalty, and somehow that unsettled her worse than any insult. She wanted to tell him to move, to say something cutting, but the words died before they formed. Instead, she walked away without a sound, the echo of his calm composure following her down the hall. By mid-morning, her art teacher announced a class project involving group work, something Sienna loathed. The teacher assigned her a partner, a timid student named Leah, whose nervous energy filled every silence. As Leah stumbled through her explanation of color palettes, Sienna rolled her eyes and snapped, "Just let me do it." The girl nodded quickly, relief and fear blending on her face. When class ended, Leah gathered her things and nearly ran out. Sienna sighed, already irritated with herself for caring so little. But when she looked out the window toward the courtyard, She saw Caleb lifting a heavy box for a teacher, his hand steady, his back straight. No one offered to help him. No one thanked him when he finished. Yet he smiled anyway. She stared for a moment, her mind oddly quiet. For someone who worked among the invisible corners of the school, he had a presence she couldn't ignore. No one had ever been that patient with her arrogance, and for reasons she didn't understand, that patience made her feel small in a way that frightened her. Later that afternoon, she found herself outside, sketchbook in hand, searching for something to draw. The garden behind the gym was empty except for Caleb repairing the handle on a maintenance door. She almost turned away, but curiosity pinned her in place. "Why do you do that yourself?" she asked suddenly. He looked up confused. "Because it's broken," he said simply. "That's not what I meant," she replied, folding her arms. "You could just call someone. That's what most people do." Caleb smiled faintly. "Most people wait for someone else to fix what they can fix themselves." The words landed heavier than she expected. She frowned, pretending not to care. "That's very philosophical for a janitor." Caleb's eyes lifted to hers, steady and unflinching. "Pain has a way of teaching lessons school never does," he said. For a brief moment, the air between them stilled. She wanted to ask what kind of pain he meant, but pride sealed her mouth. She muttered a half-hearted, "whatever," and walked away, though her pulse stayed uneven long after she left. That evening, in the privacy of her room, she opened her sketchbook and stared at the half-finished painting. The red and gray chaos she had once thought beautiful now looked empty. Her brush hovered above the page before she set it down again. The conversation with Caleb kept replaying. There was no mocking in his tone, no attempt to impress or diminish her. He had spoken to her like she was simply human, not a spectacle. That was what disturbed her most. He saw her not her father's money, not her reputation, just her. And she didn't know if she liked it or hated it. When she turned off her lamp that night, the darkness didn't feel peaceful. It felt honest. The next morning, Rosamond buzzed with energy. A board member's visit had the entire staff scrambling to impress. Teachers rearranged displays, and students rehearsed polite smiles. Caleb was sweeping near the main stairwell when one of the senior boys accidentally kicked over a potted plant, spilling dirt across the floor. Instead of helping, the boy laughed and said, "You missed a spot, Monroe." Sienna stood nearby, expecting Caleb to react, but he didn't. He crouched, scooped up the soil with his hands, and said, "Don't worry. Some messes clean easier than others." His voice was calm, but something in his eyes carried quiet disappointment. The boy shifted awkwardly before walking away. Sienna's throat tightened. She didn't know why the sight of someone humiliating him stung her more than insults ever had. Maybe because he refused to let it change him. Later during lunch, she sat by herself, an unusual choice that didn't go unnoticed. Her friends whispered, but didn't approach. Across the courtyard, she saw Caleb again carrying a toolbox under one arm. For the first time, she realized he was limping slightly, his right leg stiff. She remembered his line from yesterday, "Pain teaches lessons," and suddenly the pieces began to form. He'd been through something. Whatever it was, it hadn't hardened him like it had her. It had done the opposite. She began wondering what kind of man stayed kind when the world gave him nothing. That afternoon, rain returned, tapping lightly on the windows while the halls emptied. Sienna wandered near the maintenance corridor, pretending she was lost. She found Caleb adjusting a fluorescent light fixture, the soft yellow glow flickering over his face. "You shouldn't be up there alone," she said. "You could fall." He looked down and chuckled. "If I do, you'll catch me, right?" She almost smiled before stopping herself. "You joke a lot for someone with a mop," she said dryly. Caleb climbed down, wiping his hands on his uniform. "If I didn't, the world would be too heavy." His words lingered again, settling in her chest like warmth she wasn't ready to admit she needed. The teachers dismissed classes early, and the courtyard filled with students laughing, relieved to have even a moment of freedom. Sienna Vale stood by her locker, pretending to scroll through her phone, while her mind wandered back to Caleb Monroe. Every time she saw him, something quiet inside her shifted. He didn't talk much, but the way he moved, the calm in his voice, the steady rhythm of his work, it all stayed with her like a tune she couldn't forget. That day she told herself she wouldn't think about him again, that he was just a janitor, and she had better things to do. But when she saw him through the glass doors carrying a lunchbox and heading toward the back courtyard, her curiosity got the best of her. Without even realizing it, she followed. The back of the school was an area most students never visited, a quiet space behind the art building, with an old bench under a maple tree. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and sun-warmed stone. Sienna slowed her pace and peeked around the corner. Caleb was sitting on the bench, his lunchbox open beside him, and next to him sat a small girl with curly hair tied in uneven pigtails. She couldn't have been older than 8. The child was swinging her legs and laughing at something her father said, her laughter bright and light like wind chimes. They shared a sandwich, taking turns, and every time she giggled, Caleb's face softened in a way Sienna had never seen before. It was such an ordinary scene, so human, that it stopped her cold. For someone like her, life had always been polished, rehearsed, and distant. Seeing them felt like watching sunlight find its way into a locked room. The girl's joy felt like sunlight on her frozen world. Sienna stayed hidden, unsure why she couldn't look away. She expected to feel pity or discomfort, but instead she felt something completely foreign: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace money could buy, or silence could fake. It was something deeper, quieter, born from love that didn't need to prove itself. As she watched Caleb help his daughter wipe peanut butter from her fingers, she remembered her own childhood fragments of memory she had buried long ago. Her mother's hands stained with paint, the smell of oranges and turpentine, the sound of laughter echoing through a smaller, happier home before her father's money swallowed their lives. The memory struck her like a heartbeat, painful and sweet. For a moment she wanted to step forward to say something, but she stayed frozen behind the brick wall, afraid that if they saw her, the moment would vanish. Caleb looked down at his daughter, who was now drawing something on a napkin with a pen from his pocket. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked. "It's you," she said proudly. "You're smiling." He laughed. "I don't smile that much." The girl looked up seriously. "You do when you talk about Mom." His smile faltered for just a moment before he said softly, "Then I'll have to smile more." The tenderness in his voice pierced something inside Sienna's chest. She backed away quietly, heart pounding not from fear, but from realization. She had spent years surrounded by people who pretended to care about her, but never once had she seen anything as real as what she had just witnessed. She walked back through the school's courtyard, hearing echoes of laughter she no longer recognized as her own. That evening, she sat in her art room at home, staring at the unfinished painting that had haunted her for weeks. The reds and grays no longer spoke to her. They looked like noise. She remembered Caleb's voice, patient and grounded, and the warmth of that child's laughter that had somehow reached her through layers of pride. Without thinking, she dipped her brush into a soft yellow. The color was too bright, at first almost jarring, but as she spread it across the canvas, something inside her eased. It was the first time she had painted without anger, without trying to prove anything. The strokes came naturally soft and full of breath. When she stepped back, she didn't see chaos anymore. She saw light. The next morning when she walked into school, something in her felt lighter, though she tried not to show it. Her friends noticed anyway. "You seem different," one of them said, eyeing her suspiciously. Sienna shrugged. "Maybe I'm just tired." But she wasn't tired. She was awake for the first time in years. As she made her way to art class, she caught a glimpse of Caleb in the distance, cleaning near the stairwell. Their eyes met for a brief second, and for once she didn't look away. She gave a small nod, barely noticeable but real. Caleb returned it with a faint smile, nothing more. It was an exchange so subtle that anyone else would have missed it, yet it carried the weight of something changing. During class, her teacher noticed her new painting and paused, surprised. "This is different, Miss Vale," he said quietly. There's color now. Hope, even. Sienna didn't reply. She didn't know how to explain it, and she didn't need to. When the bell rang, she left the studio feeling strangely steady. Outside, the weather had turned soft and golden again, and as she walked past the courtyard, she saw Caleb's daughter chasing pigeons near the fountain while waiting for her father. The child waved at her without hesitation, cheerful and unguarded. Sienna blinked, unsure how to respond, then awkwardly waved back. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. That night when she got home, she told her father she didn't want the driver to wait for her after school anymore. He barely looked up from his computer. "You can do what you want, sweetheart," he said absently. She expected his indifference, but this time it didn't sting. She didn't need his approval for once. After dinner, she returned to her art room, sat in the silence, and looked again at her yellow-streaked canvas. It wasn't perfect, but neither was she. For the first time, that didn't bother her. She placed her brush down, breathed deeply, and let herself feel something she hadn't allowed in years: contentment. The following week, Rosemont Academy buzzed with preparation for its annual art showcase, an event where students competed for the attention of critics and donors rather than artistic merit. Sienna Vale had always dominated the competition. Her name alone guaranteed applause. Yet this year felt different. Her painting still stood on its easel, unfinished, a storm of black and crimson, heavy and cold. Each brushstroke mirrored the chaos inside her, but for the first time, she hated it. She had seen real emotion in Caleb Monroe's quiet kindness and in the radiant laughter of his daughter. Her art felt false now, a performance rather than truth. The showcase was scheduled for Thursday, and she couldn't bring herself to touch the canvas. When the morning came, she arrived at school early, carrying the half-done painting in its frame. She placed it near the center of the exhibit hall, surrounded by classmates who whispered nervously and compared their work. The air smelled faintly of oil paint and anticipation. The principal, dressed in a sharp navy suit, rehearsed his introduction near the podium. Caleb, as always, moved unseen through the room, cleaning and adjusting lights. Sienna caught sight of him for only a second. He looked up, nodded once, and returned to work. For reasons she couldn't explain, that small gesture steadied her more than any compliment ever had. By mid-morning, parents, teachers, and board members filled the gallery. The room sparkled with polished glass and chatter. Sienna stood beside her painting, detached, but poised, her arms crossed tightly to hide her nerves. When her turn came, the principal's voice boomed across the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, next we have Sienna Vale, daughter of Mr. Douglas Vale, presenting her piece titled Solitude." The audience leaned forward, eager to praise whatever she displayed. Sienna lifted the cover from her painting. The room fell silent. The piece was striking, but painful thick layers of red and gray twisting into shadow void of light. It screamed despair. The applause that followed was polite, but hesitant. Some saw brilliance, others saw something deeply broken. Sienna stared at the painting and felt nothing but exhaustion. She didn't even know why she painted it anymore. Then, without warning, a small voice broke through the crowd. "Your painting looks sad," the voice said, clear and innocent. Heads turned. Caleb's daughter Ari had slipped from where she was waiting for her father, and now stood in front of the crowd holding a crumpled piece of paper covered in doodles. "You should add yellow," she said proudly. "Yellow makes everything happy." The entire room froze, expecting fury. Sienna Vale, known for her temper and pride, stared at the little girl. Her classmates exchanged glances, some already bracing for the explosion they knew would follow. The principal started forward, whispering, "Miss Vale, I'll handle this." But he stopped mid-sentence. Sienna didn't move. She didn't yell. She didn't sneer. Instead, her eyes softened. Her fingers trembled slightly, and for the first time since she was a child, she felt something deep and raw. Her throat tightened, and to everyone's disbelief, her eyes filled with tears. Ari looked confused. "Did I say something wrong?" she asked. Sienna crouched slowly to the girl's level, her voice quiet and shaky. "No, she said you said something true." Caleb stepped forward quickly, apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Miss Vale." But Sienna interrupted, shaking her head. "Don't be. She just reminded me what I forgot." The entire audience stood silent, unsure whether to applaud or pretend nothing had happened. The principal cleared his throat awkwardly and the showcase continued, but no one stopped talking about the moment when the feared heiress had been humbled by a janitor's daughter. That evening, Sienna returned home carrying her painting under her arm. She went straight to her studio, turned on the light, and stared at the dark canvas. The little girl's words replayed in her mind. "You should add yellow. Yellow makes everything happy." She picked up her brush and dipped it into the brightest yellow. She had the same shade her mother once used when painting sunflowers. The first stroke across the black felt terrifying, like breaking a rule she didn't know existed. The second stroke felt easier. The third felt like breathing again. By the time she stopped, the entire canvas had changed. The darkness was still there, but now light cut through it, soft and alive. She stepped back, a tear sliding down her face without permission. For years she had painted anger because it was the only thing she understood. But now she realized anger was never truth, it was just armor. Underneath it had always been grief, and beneath grief a longing for warmth. Ari had reminded her of something her money and pride had buried: the ability to feel joy without fear. The next morning at school, whispers followed her through the hallways. "Did you see her cry?" one girl said. "She actually thanked that janitor's kid," another added. Sienna ignored them all. She carried her newly repainted canvas to class, its golden streaks shining under the fluorescent light. When Caleb passed her in the hallway pushing his cleaning cart, she stopped him. "Your daughter's very smart," she said softly. Caleb looked at her carefully, unsure of her tone. "She talks too much sometimes," he replied. Sienna shook her head. "She talks just enough." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you." Caleb frowned slightly. "For what?" "For teaching her to see light," she said before walking away. That day, Sienna felt different. She greeted her teacher with a quiet smile and held the door open for a younger student struggling with books. The staff noticed. The principal noticed. Even her classmates, long used to her sharp tongue, stared in confusion. But Sienna didn't notice their stares. Something inside her had shifted, and for the first time in years, it felt right. That night after dinner, her father called from his office asking how the showcase went. "Fine," she said, glancing at the yellow-painted canvas on her easel. "Someone told me to add a little color." He chuckled, distracted. "Good advice, I suppose." She smiled faintly, not at his words, but at the simplicity of what they meant. Life had been all shadows for so long, and all it had taken to break that spell was a child who still believed color could heal anything. The Monday after the art showcase felt different from any day Sienna Vale could remember. The moment she stepped through the doors of Rosemont Academy, something invisible had changed. The air didn't feel heavy anymore, and the students who usually scattered when she entered no longer looked quite as afraid. She didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't as if she had become someone else overnight, yet every part of her felt looser, freer, as if she had been holding her breath for years and finally let it go. She walked through the hallways where her reputation had once walked before her like a warning, and for the first time there was silence. No whisper of fear, no forced compliments, just quiet curiosity. Some students avoided her, uncertain if the change was real. Others peeked from behind lockers, waiting for the storm that never came. Even the teachers who had learned to fear her temper now greeted her cautiously. Sienna didn't blame them. She didn't quite believe herself yet either. She carried the memory of the little girl's voice from the showcase, bright and clear. "You should add yellow," and every time it replayed, she smiled, in spite of herself. Caleb Monroe arrived that morning earlier than usual, as he always did with his worn uniform and steady gait. He had heard about what happened during the art show, though no one had told him directly. Whispers traveled fast in Rosemont, but kindness traveled quietly. He hadn't expected to see Sienna that day yet when he turned the corner near the art wing. There she was standing by the same bench where she had once glared at him for existing. She looked up, her eyes softer now, almost hesitant. "Morning," she said, the word small but sincere. Caleb blinked, surprised. "Morning, Miss Vale," he replied. She shook her head. "Just Sienna." It was such a simple correction, but it carried weight neither of them acknowledged. He nodded once, not prying, and continued mopping. For a few seconds, she stood there awkwardly before saying, "Your daughter's got good taste in colors." He looked up, smiling faintly. "She gets that from her mom." Sienna didn't know what to say, so she just said, "She's smart." Caleb didn't answer, but the look in his eyes, pride, quiet, and strong, was enough. When she left, she realized that for the first time in years, she had spoken to someone without needing to win. By lunchtime, the change in her behavior had begun to ripple through the school. Her classmates gathered at their usual table, but Sienna chose a smaller one near the window. The noise of laughter and gossip filled the cafeteria, yet her mind was elsewhere. She remembered how Ari had stood in front of her painting, fearless and honest. That kind of innocence used to annoy her. Now it fascinated her. She thought of Caleb's calm voice, his patience, and the way he treated everyone the same. He didn't have to earn respect to give it, and that realization unsettled her more than she expected. As she picked at her food, she overheard whispers nearby. "She's sitting alone again," one voice said. "Maybe she's planning something." Another snickered. "Maybe she's broken." Sienna didn't react. The words rolled off her this time. She wasn't broken. She was simply done pretending she was whole. After lunch, she walked past the courtyard and noticed Caleb again, fixing one of the benches. Beside him was Ari, drawing with crayons on a piece of paper spread across the ground. The sight made her stop. Without thinking, she walked over. Caleb looked up but didn't speak, sensing she had something on her mind. Ari smiled up at her eyes, bright as the sun. "Hi, Miss Artist," she chirped. Sienna laughed softly. "Just Sienna," she said, kneeling beside her. The girl held up her drawing. It was of 3 people standing under a big yellow sun. "That's you," she said, pointing to the tallest figure. "And that's my dad, and that's me." Sienna blinked, caught off guard. "You drew me. You're our friend now," Ari said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Caleb started to say something, but Sienna raised her hand gently. "No, it's fine," she said, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small container of grapes from her lunch. "You like fruit?" Ari nodded eagerly. "Then it's yours." Ari grinned, taking it like a treasure, and for the first time Sienna shared her lunch with someone else. It wasn't planned, it wasn't a statement, it was just real. Behind the school bench, the same spot where she had once watched them from a distance, she sat beside Caleb and his daughter. For a few minutes there were no labels, no walls, no billionaire's daughter or janitor's family. Just 3 people sharing a meal under the faint rustle of leaves. Her classmates passed by in disbelief, their eyes wide. "Is that Sienna Vale?" one whispered. "She's eating with him," another added, scandalized. But Sienna didn't care. The whispers didn't sting anymore. They sounded distant, meaningless, like echoes from a life that no longer belonged to her. When she finally stood to leave, Ari hugged her without hesitation. "Bye, Miss Artist," she said again. Sienna smiled. "See you soon, Sunshine." Caleb raised an eyebrow, amused. "Sunshine?" She shrugged. "Seems to fit." That afternoon, Sienna returned to art class, where her teacher asked if she wanted to submit her repainted canvas to an upcoming exhibition downtown. The old Sienna would have demanded to headline it. The new one just said, if it helps others see something good, sure. Her teacher looked startled, but nodded approvingly. When class ended, Sienna stayed behind, cleaning brushes that weren't hers. It was a small thing, but it felt meaningful. Each motion reminded her of Caleb's steady patient, never waiting for thanks. Later that evening, as she walked out of school, she found Caleb locking the maintenance shed. "You staying late again?" she asked. He smiled. "That's the job." She hesitated before saying, "You know, I used to think kindness was weakness." He glanced at her. "And now I think it's the only thing that actually changes anything," she said quietly. He nodded, once the kind of nod that didn't need words. Before leaving, she added, "Tell Ari her artist friend says hi." He chuckled. "She'll like that." At home, the silence of her father's mansion no longer felt as suffocating. She set her bag down and looked at her painting, now framed and glowing faintly under the lamplight. The yellow shimmered like captured sunlight. She remembered the warmth of the afternoon, the laughter, the bench, the way Ari's small hand had squeezed hers. For years, she had believed connection was something to be controlled, bought, or feared. Now she understood it was something you gave freely or not at all. Before bed, she texted her father for the first time in weeks. "Hope work's going well. I painted again." He didn't reply, but she didn't need him to. The approval she'd spent her life chasing suddenly felt irrelevant. The peace she'd found was quieter, stronger, and entirely her own. The next few weeks passed quietly at Rosemont Academy, the kind of quiet that carried weight instead of peace. The students whispered about Sienna Vale's transformation as though it were a strange miracle, and even the teachers watched her as if waiting for her to snap back to her old self. But she didn't. She arrived early, stayed late, and no longer barked at anyone who crossed her path. She smiled sometimes genuinely, and even offered to help organize art supplies in the studio. It confused everyone, including herself. Each morning she crossed paths with Caleb Monroe, and though their exchanges were brief, they held a warmth that words didn't need. He'd nod and she'd smile. Sometimes Ari would wave from a distance. Those small moments had become the most human parts of her day. And then without warning, he was gone. It started on a cold Wednesday morning. The air was sharp, the sky dull, and the first thing Sienna noticed when she arrived was the silence in the hall. The usual faint humming she'd come to expect from Caleb wasn't there. The maintenance cart sat unused near the stairs, the floor half mopped. She waited, assuming he was running late, but as the day dragged on, the emptiness began to feel wrong. By afternoon, a teacher mentioned quietly, "The janitor didn't come in today." Someone else added, "He hasn't called either." Sienna tried to act like she didn't care, but her pulse quickened. The next morning, he still wasn't there. By lunch, she overheard 2 staff members whispering in the teacher's lounge. Caleb had been taken to the hospital the night before after collapsing in his apartment. He was stable, but there were complications, and he couldn't afford the treatment he needed. That single sentence cut through her like a blade. The rest of the day blurred. She sat through classes without hearing a word, her hands shaking under the desk. When the final bell rang, she didn't head to her car. She called her driver to tell him she wouldn't need a ride, and walked straight toward the city, instead the late autumn wind biting at her face. She didn't stop until she reached the towering glass building downtown, with the Golden Vale Corporation logo stretched across the entrance. Inside, people moved with urgency, carrying laptops and ambition. The receptionist started to greet her, but one look at her expression, and she waved them off. She knew exactly where her father would be, top floor behind a desk that overlooked the city he believed he owned. The elevator ride felt endless. A reflection in the mirrored walls showed a girl she barely recognized, strong, determined, terrified. When the doors opened, she walked past his assistants without a word. Her father, Douglas Vale, was on the phone, pacing. He looked up in surprise when she burst through the door. "Sienna, what on earth? I need your help," she said, cutting him off. He blinked. "This better not be about another car or some nonsense charity gala. It's not about me." She snapped louder than she meant to. The words startled them both. For the first time, her voice didn't sound like entitlement, it sounded human. "It's about someone who works at my school. He's in the hospital. He's sick and he can't pay for treatment." Douglas frowned, unimpressed. "We donate to hospitals every quarter. That's already more than enough." Sienna's hands clenched. "That's not the same." He sighed, turning back to his desk. "Sienna, this isn't our responsibility. You can't fix every sad story you come across. I'm not trying to fix every story," she said fiercely, her voice trembling, "just one." Her father froze, the tone catching him off guard. She stepped closer, eyes bright with anger and desperation. "He's a good man, Dad. The kind of person who works harder than anyone in your company ever will. He taught me more about kindness in a month than all your money ever taught me." Douglas stared at her unblinking. "You're serious," he said finally. "Yes," she whispered. "For once I am." The room went silent. Then, without another word, he pressed a button on his phone. "Get St. Jude's Hospital on the line," he told his assistant. "Tell them to transfer all costs for a patient named Caleb Monroe, under Vail Foundation coverage." He glanced back at Sienna. "You'll send me his details later." She exhaled shakily, relief and disbelief mixing in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, still processing the strange shift in his daughter. "You really care about this man?" he asked. Sienna met his eyes. "No," she said, and then corrected herself. "Not just him, what he stands for." He didn't understand, but for once he didn't argue. That night, a private ambulance arrived at the small public hospital on the east side of the city. The nurses were confused, but grateful when a team of specialists came in with instructions to move a patient named Caleb Monroe to a private ward. The bills were cleared before anyone could ask questions. When Caleb woke later, groggy, but aware, he asked how it happened. The nurse smiled and said, "You must have good friends." Caleb didn't have to ask who. At school the next day, Sienna sat quietly in art class pretending to paint, while everyone whispered around her. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. The gossip was relentless anyway. "I heard her father donated to some janitor," one student said. Can you imagine? Sienna ignored them. For once, she didn't care what they thought. She was still thinking about the look on her father's face, the confusion, the reluctant respect. It was the first time he had looked at her not as a burden or brand, but as something closer to a person. She hadn't expected that. 2 days later, she went to the hospital herself. The staff knew her name and let her in without question. Caleb was awake, sitting upright, pale but smiling. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly when she walked in. "And you shouldn't have been there alone," she replied. He chuckled weakly. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, sitting down beside him, "but I wanted to." He looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Sienna." She shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to get better. Ari needs you." His expression softened at his daughter's name. "She'll be fine. She's tougher than I am. She learned that from you," she said, and for a few seconds they both sat in quiet understanding. When she left the hospital that evening, the sunset was streaked with gold, the same yellow she'd added to her painting weeks before. The city lights flickered to life as she walked, and though she didn't have a plan for what came next, she didn't need one. For the first time, she had done something that mattered, something real. When the winter frost began to fade, Rosemont Academy came alive again, with sunlight glinting through the tall glass panels, and the students returned from break with their usual chatter about vacations, luxury gifts, and new cars. But something about the building felt different now, and no one could quite explain why. Maybe it was the stillness that lingered in the mornings, or the faint smell of fresh paint that carried a warmth the walls had never known. On that first Monday after the break, the custodial closet opened quietly, and Caleb Monroe stepped back into the school he had nearly died away from. His uniform hung a little looser on him, his skin paler, his movements slower, but his eyes still held the same steady calm that had once unsettled Sienna Vail. The hallways were empty when he arrived, the echo of his footsteps steady against the marble floor. As he turned the corner, he froze. The hallway he had spent years cleaning, the one that had seen his quiet work ignored by hundreds of students, was no longer dull and gray. It was bright, painted in a soft shade of yellow that seemed to hold sunlight inside it. The walls gleamed as if they had been waiting for this color all along. And on the center of that wall, framed neatly, was a plaque made of dark walnut wood with silver lettering that caught the morning light. Sometimes the smallest hearts hold the greatest strength. For a long moment, Caleb just stood there, the words blurring behind the sting in his eyes. His throat tightened. He knew exactly who had done it. He didn't need confirmation, but later that morning when he entered the courtyard, Sienna was already there. She stood by the bench where Ari used to draw her hair tucked into a loose braid, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet peace. When she saw him, her lips curved into a small smile that said everything without a word. "You came back," she said softly. "Couldn't let my mop miss me too much," he replied, his voice still rough from recovery. She laughed lightly, and for a second it was as if the world outside that courtyard didn't exist. They sat together for a while, not as heiress and janitor, but as two people who had seen each other's pain and chosen to respect it. "You didn't have to do all this," he said finally. "The paint, the plaque, all of it." Sienna looked at the yellow glow reflecting on the tiles and shook her head. "Yes, I did," she whispered. "You changed how I see everything, and I wanted this place to remember it even if they don't know why." Caleb's brows furrowed. "You didn't put your name on it. It's not about names," she said. "It's about meaning." When classes began, students flooded the halls whispering about the transformation. "Did the school pay for this one?" asked. "Looks too nice to be an accident." Another said maybe the board finally did something good. But the teachers knew better, and a few of them, the ones who had seen Sienna repainting the hall in secret over the break, smiled quietly to themselves. They didn't reveal the truth. Rosemont was a school that had always celebrated competition, but this was different. It wasn't a gesture made for praise. It was gratitude painted into permanence. Throughout the day, Caleb moved from room to room fixing lights and polishing floors, his body weaker, but his spirit stronger. Everywhere he went, someone noticed him now. Students nodded respectfully. Teachers thanked him. Even the principal stopped by to shake his hand, fumbling through words about community and inspiration. Caleb didn't know what to say to any of it. He just smiled and kept working. That was who he was. Later, when he passed the art room, he saw Sienna bent over her easel again, sunlight spilling across her shoulders. This time her painting wasn't dark. The canvas glowed with yellows, whites, and faint blues, the same colors that now covered the walls of the hallway. She looked up as he passed, and their eyes met briefly. He gave her a small nod, and she nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. The art spoke for both of them. By the end of the week, Sienna had taken over small projects around the school. She volunteered at the supply drive, organized an after-school art club, and even convinced the board to sponsor lunches for students who couldn't afford them. The same teachers who had once whispered about her arrogance now whispered in awe. One even joked, "If this is what kindness looks like, maybe we should all start painting in yellow." Sienna didn't care about their approval anymore, but she couldn't help feeling grateful for the peace that came with purpose. Her father, hearing about her work through the board's chairman, called her one evening. "I saw the article about Rosemont's new charity program," he said, his tone unreadable. "Your idea?" She smiled faintly, holding the phone to her ear. "Kind of," she replied. "I just helped start it." There was a pause before he said quietly, "Your mother would be proud." That sentence was worth more than every luxury she'd ever been given. The next day, Sienna arrived early again and found Caleb adjusting the plaque in the yellow hallway. He stepped back, checking the alignment. "Still not perfect," he murmured. "It's fine," she said, smiling. "Perfection's overrated anyway." Maybe he said, glancing at her, "But gratitude isn't." They stood side by side, the morning light filling the corridor like warmth. A few students passed and slowed down, staring at the plaque, reading its words. One girl whispered, "That's beautiful." Another boy said, "Who put it here?" Caleb and Sienna exchanged a look, but said nothing. Some things didn't need ownership. They just needed to exist. As the weeks went on, the yellow hallway became more than just a passage between classes. It became a symbol. Students lingered there between periods, teachers brought guests to see it, and even the principal admitted it had changed the atmosphere of the entire school. And though no one ever said it aloud, everyone sensed the truth that kindness had quietly rewritten the walls of Rosemont, not with money or policy, but with paint and heart. One afternoon, while Caleb packed his tools, Ari ran in after school, her backpack bouncing. "Dad," she shouted, waving a small envelope. "Guess what Miss Sienna helped me get into the art camp? She told them I'm a natural." Caleb smiled, his tired eyes brightening. She wasn't wrong. Sienna appeared behind her, holding a paper cup of coffee. "Hope you don't mind," she said lightly. "She's got more talent than the rest of this school combined." Caleb laughed quietly. That she does. Ari hugged Sienna tightly, her small arms around the girl who had once terrified a school. You're the best Miss Artist, Sienna knelt to meet her gaze. Not even close, she said softly. But I'm learning. The final days of the school year arrived with spring unfolding across the city. The air was warmer now, filled with the scent of wet soil and blooming magnolias, and Rosemont Academy no longer felt like the cold monument of power it once had been. The yellow hallway had become its quiet heart, the place where students slowed their steps without realizing why, where teachers smiled for no reason, and where Caleb Monroe's work was no longer invisible. Every morning when he unlocked the doors, he was greeted by nods, smiles, and small words of gratitude from people who once never saw him at all. Sienna Vale walked those same halls differently now, no longer commanding space through fear, but sharing it through presence. She volunteered at the art program she had founded, organized mural projects for underprivileged schools, and spent most of her afternoons helping younger students find their own voice through color. When people whispered about her these days, it wasn't with dread, it was with respect. Her transformation had become a quiet legend that spread through the city, the story of the billionaire's daughter who learned kindness from a janitor's child. She didn't seek recognition. She only wanted to keep building something real, something that would last beyond her father's empire. On the last Friday of the semester, Rosemont hosted an open house for families. The courtyard was filled with chatter, the walls glowed beneath the afternoon sun, and laughter echoed from every corner. Caleb was setting up chairs near the art display, while Ari skipped circles around him, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. Sienna arrived carrying a box of lemonade cups, dressed simply in a white shirt and paint-stained jeans. The sight of her made a few parents blink in disbelief, but she didn't notice. Her focus was on Ari, who ran up to her with a grin. "Miss Artist, I drew something new," Sienna laughed, kneeling down. "Show me." Ari flipped open the sketchbook to a drawing of the yellow hallway, the plaque at its center, with 3 small figures standing in front of it. A tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long hair. Above them, the sun stretched across the page, bright and endless. Sienna blinked hard to keep the tears from falling. "This is beautiful," she whispered. Ari smiled. "Dad says kindness is like sunlight. You can't see it, but you can feel it." Sienna swallowed the lump in her throat and smiled through the ache in her chest. "Then I want to be someone's sunlight too," she said softly. Caleb, who had been watching nearby, stopped what he was doing, his expression caught between pride and disbelief. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her carried all the words he didn't need to say. The event continued into the evening, filled with warmth and music. Sienna's father arrived unexpectedly, his presence drawing murmurs from parents and faculty alike. He moved through the crowd with practiced confidence until he found his daughter helping Ari hand out lemonade. He paused, seeing her laugh, her hair loose and her hands sticky from spilled juice. It struck him how much she looked like her mother in that moment, unguarded, alive. When she noticed him, she froze, unsure of what to expect. But instead of scolding or questioning, Douglas Vale smiled faintly and said, "I saw the hallway. You did well." It was the simplest acknowledgement, but it carried more meaning than any of his business accolades ever had. Sienna nodded slowly. "I just added color," she replied. He looked at Caleb, who stood quietly beside the refreshment table, and extended his hand. "I owe you thanks," Douglas said. Caleb hesitated, then shook it firmly. "No, sir. You don't owe me anything. Your daughter did the work herself." Douglas's eyes softened for a brief moment. "Maybe," he said, "but you reminded her what work really means." Then he excused himself politely, leaving the two of them standing there under the fading light. As the sun began to dip beyond the academy's glass walls, Sienna helped pack up chairs and decorations. The courtyard slowly emptied until only she, Caleb, and Ari remained. The air shimmered gold as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, casting reflections across the yellow-painted hallway. Ari climbed onto the bench and looked up at the plaque, reading it aloud. In her small, clear voice, "Sometimes the smallest hearts hold the greatest strength." She turned to her father. "That's you, Daddy." Caleb smiled, shaking his head. "No, sweetheart, that's you." And maybe her. He nodded towards Sienna, who stood quietly watching them. She laughed softly. No, that's all of us, she said. We each painted a part of this. The three of them stood together in the corridor, surrounded by the glow of that simple, perfect light. Sienna thought of the girl she had been, the one who believed power came from fear, who measured worth in control. That version of herself felt like a shadow, now fading beneath the brilliance of what she'd found instead. Ari tugged at Sienna's sleeve. Will you still be here next year? She asked. Sienna knelt and brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face. Of course, she said. There's still more to paint. Ari giggled. Maybe a sky next time, maybe, Sienna said. But we'll start with yellow. Caleb watched them, his chest tight with a pride he couldn't quite express. He'd spent his life believing his role was to clean what others dirtied, to fade into the background, and make things shine for people who never noticed. Yet somehow his quiet presence had changed an entire world he'd never been meant to enter. He didn't have wealth, fame, or power, but he had proof that decency could ripple farther than any fortune. As they left the school together, the glass doors reflected their figures against the golden light. One man carrying tools, one girl carrying hope, and one woman carrying redemption. The campus lights flickered on, chasing the twilight, and for a brief moment it was impossible to tell who belonged where, because in that glow there was no hierarchy, no title, no separation between the rich and the ordinary. There were only people equal, flawed, and beautiful in their shared humanity. When they reached the front gate, Sienna turned back for one last look at the hallway glowing behind them. The plaque's silver letters gleamed like embers in the dusk. She whispered quietly, almost to herself. You were right, Caleb. Pain does teach lessons school never does. He smiled, and joy teaches the rest. Ari reached for both their hands, her small fingers bridging the distance between two worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. Together they walked toward the setting sun, their shadows stretching side by side along the ground. And in that moment, as light poured across the path ahead, it became clear that it wasn't power or wealth or status that left the deepest mark. It was simple, human kindness passed from one heart to another, like sunlight moving quietly through glass, warming everything it touched. The end. If this story moved, you make sure to subscribe, and share it so more people can feel its message. Tell us in the comments what part of the story touched you most, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel.